coordination. And indeed, I think we are all worse off for not having a process whereby these important issues rise to the highest level of political attention and force bureaucracies across the country, to force non-governmental organizations like the Stimson Center, private industry, and others to share and better coordinate in order to address this common threat. In the absence of that process, it has certainly come to our attention that there have been a number of efforts to try to bring greater transparency, and I think no more notable efforts have been made than those by the government of Finland. They have made it, I think, their common mission as a government to think through in innovative ways not only different approaches to addressing radiological and nuclear insecurity, but also to try to enhance and bring us all together to share information more effectively and to think creatively about how to share that information. And they have done it, I would suggest, in a very typical Finnish way, quietly, competently, and without much fanfare. It's very un-American, Jari. I will say it's very un-American. The Stimson Center this year celebrates its 30th anniversary, and as I look back at the history of this organization, what I am most proud of across the work of my colleagues, many of whom you will hear here this afternoon, is the pragmatism with which they have brought to their efforts. They don't just think, they do. I'm not sure if Twain said that or if it was a Nike commercial, but it's true nonetheless. They have really rolled up their sleeves in a very practical way. They have done the creative thinking around big problems, and they have applied those problems in a very practical way in the field. And again, you're going to hear some of that here this afternoon. I thought that this was a unique opportunity with the visit to town of the Finnish ambassador, Jari Luoto, who is responsible for the implementation and assessment group of the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, and has spent many years of his career as a Finnish diplomat working on these issues, as well as a number of adjacent issues that he can share with you. Finland, for us, has been an inspiration in this space. It is clear, based upon their work, that you do not need to be the biggest government in the world to have a practical impact in this space, and they have showed us that you do not have to be the biggest think tank in Washington, D.C. to have a practical impact in this space. So we thank you, Jari, for your government's commitment, your support of the Stimson Center, but also your commitment to this issue in particular, particularly in the wake of the Nuclear Security Summit process, to provide a true global service, I think, to around this issue. And so with that, Ambassador Luoto is going to give a few brief opening remarks to talk a little bit about what Finland has done and what they are doing in this space. And then we're going to turn to three of my colleagues. Many of you, I suspect, know Richard Cupit from his time at the UN, in academia before that, and more recently at the State Department. He came and joined us a year or so ago. We're very proud to have him leading much of our proliferation prevention work here at the Stimson Center. Next to him is Seema Gullit. Seema has joined us after a career in academia and has done some of the most impressive work, I think, and very practical work, particularly in countries of the developing world, helping governments understand and ultimately implement their non-proliferation obligations. And last, but certainly not least, Cindy Vestergaard, who has been with us for 4 years, I believe. What seems like 4. It seems like 4. I'm going to go with 4.
4, sure.
4 years. And Cindy really is going to share some very interesting work. She has done some very creative work in the past on the nuclear security around the fuel cycle, and more recently has turned and is doing some of the most, I think, innovative work in this town on nuclear security by applying the blockchain to nuclear security. And she's going to talk a little bit about her collaboration in that space. But with that, Ambassador, a very warm welcome to the Stimson Center. Thank you for being here. And the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Brian. You made up for quite a lot of the modesty that we Finns might have on our role in nuclear security. I really want to thank the Stimson Center for organizing this event to present some of the results of our collaborative projects with Stimson. And at the outset, I would like to also offer great thanks to Rick Cubitt, who has done a marvelous job in this project in 2018 and still continuing with us in 2019. I would like to start by offering a few clues on why Finland has taken an interest in enhanced nuclear security. Finland's Ministry for Foreign Affairs has a long tradition already working with Stimson. Dates back to more than over 10 years. We've been especially working together in order to support the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which, as you probably all are aware, calls for all states to adopt and enforce appropriate laws as well as other effective measures to prevent the proliferation of nuclear, chemical or biological weapons and their means of delivery to non-state actors, in particular for terrorist purposes. So during the past years and continuing in 2019, we have decided to direct our attention and joint efforts to improve the security of radioactive sources. Nuclear and radiological security is very much at the forefront of the unit for arms control at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And collaboration with Stimson and the research done in this project also supports the role that we have had in the global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism, or GICNT for short. For those that might not be so familiar with the GICNT's activities, I would like to offer just some brief remarks on the role that this network plays. This network was established in 2006 at the initiative of the Presidents of the United States and the Russian Federation at the time, George W. Bush and Vladimir Putin. And the two countries continue to remain as the co-chairs of the network. Since its launch, the GICNT has grown to a network of 88 partner nations and 6 international observer organizations, including the IEA, Interpol, the European Union, and 3 specialized UN agencies, which you see here as abbreviations. You can see from the chart that the GICNT has organized its activities around 3 working groups. They're called the Nuclear Detection Working Group, currently chaired by the United Kingdom, the Nuclear Forensics Working Group, currently chaired by Canada, and the Response and Mitigation Working Group, currently chaired by Argentina. The GICNT is very much about bringing together different communities of experts crucial to nuclear security. We bring together security organizations, people working with rescue activities, intelligence, and nuclear security, radiation safety specialists. GICNT is very much about organizing what I would call hands-on events that offer the possibility for these authorities and experts from partner nations and international observer organizations to come together and to learn about each other's methods of workings and protocols in order to foster the development and sustainability of a nuclear security culture. At the same time, we share expertise and experiences and build linkages across the disciplines and between the participating countries. And if you'd like to summarize the sort of philosophy of the GICNT, we integrate, we convene, and we exchange. GICNT has developed several publications, but in recent years there has been an explicit wish of partner nations and the international observer organizations for the GICNT to organize even more exercises and workshops. Now we have done more than over 100 events. Here you can see only a very small collection of events that the GICNT has organized in the past last years. Finland has been an active partner nation in GICNT for quite a few years. In 2015, Finland organized the plenary meeting of the network, and also in 2015 a nuclear detection exercise named Northern Lights. The logo of that exercise can also be seen in this slide. In 2015-2017, Finland is also responsible for chairing the nuclear detection working group of the GICNT, and since 2017 we've been responsible for the implementation and assessment group of the network. Since the plenary meeting that the GICNT had in Tokyo in June 2017, I've been delegated from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland and from the Unit of Arms Control to work as the what you might call the international coordinator or the IG coordinator for the GICNT. Last thing I want to emphasize about the work of the GICNT is the fact that we are working really closely with our international observer organizations in order to make sure that we are supporting the important nuclear security work that is done by these international organizations and not duplicating. So, and I think that the GICNT has been very successful in finding its best possible role in support of the work done by the IEA, the European Union, and Interpol, and the three specialized UN agencies that are very much working also with activities to improve nuclear and radiological security globally. I would like to highlight also the close cooperation that we do internally in Finland with our regulatory body. Finland's Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority, called STUK, is a widely respected actor in international nuclear security and safety activities. The IEA has been using for years STUK's training services as their main partner in training of IEA's inspectors, and STUK is also continuously involved in training of newcomer countries' experts in nuclear safeguards. The MFA of Finland works very closely with STUK, both in supporting GICNT's activities and also in the international partnership for nuclear disarmament verification, and in Finland's participation in other international joint efforts in the nuclear sphere. And actually only last week the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and STUK together hosted a working meeting of the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, or the IPNDV, in Helsinki. Finland's history working with international efforts to manage nuclear security dates back to the time when the treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, commonly known as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT, was negotiated. Finland was among the first signatories of the NPT, which actually was a very important element in our policy of developing our own nuclear energy production. Finland was also the first country in the world to sign in 1971 and ratify in 1972 the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement with the IEA that is required from countries joining the NPT. I should mention that today Finland is still expanding our program with 4 nuclear power plants in operation, the 5th completed and given a green line for its operating license to be approved any day now by the Council of State in Finland, and groundwork started already for the 6th NPP. We'll also be the first country in the world to open a geological final depository for highly radioactive waste. At the same time, our Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority is offering training for newcomer countries, establishing their respective authorities to oversee a country's nuclear energy program. So this is the background for Finland's active participation in international efforts to improve both safety and security of nuclear and other radioactive material. I would like to emphasize the fact that Finnish experts have also benefited a lot from participation in these international efforts. Participation in exercises, workshops and seminars, and taking part in the planning of these events gives always the possibility to expand our own knowledge and improve our own act in nuclear security. It gives the possibility to compare your own procedures, protocols and capabilities with other countries and find ways of developing your own procedures. It also gives you important links to colleagues and institutions and helps to build regional and wider international cooperation, something that is very much also in the forefront in all the activities of the GICNT. At its best, international cooperation might give you an access to resources that might come in need in case of a real nuclear or radiological incident. Thus, there are many good, I would say even compelling reasons to engage in these international activities. When we are thinking of the threat of terrorism, of course, we are also speaking about an international threat that spills and crosses over the borders, and that is another good reason to engage actively in international cooperation for better nuclear security. When Finland and Stimson started with the collaborative project, the results of which are presented to you today, we wanted to focus on an issue which had come to the forefront in discussion with international partners working for nuclear security. There are literally thousands and thousands of radioactive sources in use in civilian institutions as they are used in industry, medicine and also in agriculture. Whereas only some of these sources are likely to be useful to terrorists, there are many which could be used for harmful purposes, for example, building a so-called dirty bomb. International agreements and guidance exist on the security of these sources, but much of it is not mandatory, and the actual implementation of existing guidance is naturally dependent on the willingness, knowledge and resources of both the users and the national authorities that are responsible for overseeing the implementation of these security measures. We know that serious gaps exist in implementing the Code of Conduct on the safe and security of radioactive sources, and you will hear more about these findings in this project from BRIC really soon. And we hope that the work that is being done in this collaborative project between Finland and the Stimson Center will be useful and will be used to step up the international efforts for improved security of radiological sources. I want to thank once again Stimson Center for organizing this event. We will continue to discuss the results of not only this collaborative project, but also hear more about cooperation that is being done in the sphere of nuclear security, and I'll be happy to join in the discussion and answer any questions that you might have on our activities in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Luoto. What we'd like to do is give you an opportunity to ask a few questions of the ambassador directly, and then after that question period, we'll briefly describe, first I and Sima will describe the radiological source security project that we're working with, that Finland has been so kind to support, and then turn it over for a few comments on a new project, also with Finland and Stuk, that will be headed by my colleague Cindy Vestergaard. So we'll go through sort of the additional projects after taking a few questions and answers. Let me, sir, please, if you could state your name and affiliation, and please feel free. I would request there be questions more than comments, but I know that's always difficult. So.
Yeah, Mike Roches, formerly with the DoD and the Department of State. Mr. Ambassador, can you share any success stories where we have precluded a terrorist activity that could relate in a biological or nuclear event?
I wouldn't be able to go into any details, but I can tell you that normally every time that the GICNT is gathering experts from our partner nations and international observer organizations to an exercise, to a seminar, or to a workshop, we are also dealing with experiences from particular situations where luckily the authorities have normally been able to prevent these acts to actually happen. Unfortunately, we have seen that there are organizations, individuals that have been capable of going quite far in preparation of incidents that would include the use mainly normally of radiological sources for their purposes. And our task is really to make sure that the authorities continue to be successful in preventing these acts to happen. And it is one of the main aims of the GICNT to build a nuclear security architecture that expands basically to all countries that are using these sources in order to make it as unlikely as possible that terrorist groups or individuals are getting hands getting these sources into their hands. Many times when we are talking about dirty bombs, for example, we are talking about risk that probably would not involve causing more human losses than a normal explosive would do. But then the economical consequences and the psychological consequences of terrorists acquiring or actually using these sources, they would be paramountful. And this is one of the facts that we have learned when we have been going through scenarios in GICNT's exercises and workshops.
Thank you very much for the question. And please.
My name is Roger Chetty. I work with private equity in the technology sector. And three sort of quick questions. First, could you describe the relationship between the GICNT and the NPT review conference next year? Is there a role, or Is it built into it, or are they just completely independent? Second, have the tensions between your two co-chairs over the past few years had any impact on the GICNT, your obvious United States and Russia? And I can't remember the third one, but we'll stick with those two for now. Thank you.
There's no link between the NPT process and the GICNT. In the GICNT, in this network, we have underlined that we are a network of partner nations and the international observer organizations that wants to concentrate on bringing the different communities of experts together and to foster cooperation that helps us in preventing terrorist organizations ever acquiring or being able to use these radioactive sources. Part of the success of the GICNT and the fact that the United States and Russia, and this is also partly an answer to your second question, have been able to continue this cooperation despite all the other political difficulties at the moment. Part of the success is based on the fact that we are keeping away from the political discussions. We do not discuss political declarations on these issues, but we continue on the practical work of bringing the different communities together in order to enhance nuclear security. And this is the reason why we have countries like China, India, Pakistan, Israel, many Arab states also actively participating in our activities, and this is the way how we would like to keep it in the future. Here I'm speaking only as one partner nation and as the coordinator, but I'm sure that this is something that the co-chairs have underlined and will continue to do so also in the future. It is, of course, of additional value that this is an area where the United States and Russian Federation continue to cooperation, as we are living in exceptionally difficult times in any issues that have to do with nuclear.
Please.
Say anything about North Korea?
Well, I don't think there's nothing significant that I would be able to add. I mean, of course, it is the wish of anyone working with nuclear security that we would be able to see some progress in the talks about denuclearization, about permanent denuclearization of North Korea. And we all hope to see progress in that respect. Maybe in the future, if we are successful in that, that is also the time when you are able to welcome North Korea as a participant in the activities that are destined to keeping these sources away from the hands of terrorist organizations. But that would mean that North Korea, as any other state, would have to abide with the 8 very simple nuclear security principles that are in the background of the GICNT's work.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any further questions for the moment? We can always take more questions later, too. Please, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm Carlos Del Toro. I'm on the board of directors here at Stimson. Could you comment on the impact that social media and the internet has had in either making your job more difficult or in some ways perhaps?
Very interesting question, and actually we have approached the whole issue of public communication in several instances when we have been organizing GICNT events in the past 2 or 3 years. And actually at a meeting, at the Implementation Assessment Group meeting that I was hosting last June in Helsinki, this was one of the topics for which we devoted the whole day, because it is an issue that is very much at the forefront for any authorities that have to deal with preparing for a nuclear security or radiological incident. And the importance of social media, both in good and in bad, is clearly changing the landscape if you compare the present situation with what we had 20 years ago, when it was much more easier, I think, for any authority to convey a credible, simple message that will be channeled through particular media channels and in a very, let's say, precise form, without any alterations and without much of a competition from other sources. Today, the landscape is totally different in that respect, and that is something that is very much discussed for a good reason in GICNT circles, how to adapt to this new reality of the social media, how to prepare to counter any misinformation that might lead to serious difficulties in convincing or in protecting the public. So it's an issue that has come to the forefront also within the GICNT.
We still have a few more minutes for this segment before we start. So let me actually turn to my panelists. Do they have any additional questions? Any more? We will, if not, please, sir.
Yeah.
Please, sir.
Sure. My question is, I spent some time reporting in Pakistan, and there's always growing concern, at least in the United States and elsewhere, of course, on this ability of the Pakistani government and the possible taking of fuels and other materials, nuclear bombs and others, exported from Canada commercially to Mexico and try to border. Do you care to comment on that?
From the GICNT's perspective, of course, we are happy that we've been able to engage also the Pakistani authorities and their specialists in our network, and are really convinced that it's useful to have them engaged in this type of international cooperations. From the other proliferation point of view, more in my role as an ambassador at the Unit for Arms Control, I would not like to dwell at this occasion more on this, but of course it is our continuous worry that we've seen that it has become at least a bit more difficult to keep up the non-proliferation regimes and practices because of the challenges that the whole system that we have developed is now facing. So I wouldn't be going into the specifics, but anyone understand that with the pressures to non-proliferation and with the existence of terrorist organizations that have an interest of getting their hands into these sources, the situation is certainly not tranquil at the moment.
Thank you. Anupam, please.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm asking you two questions. One would be a longer range and one more immediate. The United Arab Emirates, as you know, went through its own stages of signing certain declarations on the no ENR, no enrichment and reprocessing. And the Korean government won the contract to build 4 reactors there. And it's under construction, 3 years, perhaps 4 years. It'll be deployed. A whole range of nuclear material, other things will be there, and from there on. There has been tightening on the ports and the export control regulations and so on. Is that on the radar of the GICNT in terms of nuclear material being introduced in that sensitive area, and how accounting, many other things will be done? The other is a longer range, perhaps after the discussion happens, or these presentations, we can talk about this, which is that in my role or in our role as part of the technical experts group on regimes on the sidelines of the NSG and others, We've seen over the last few years the Interpol and others come up with presentations where they talk about the darknet and the movement of payments through shady banks and others to facilitate nuclear-related transfers and so on, cryptocurrency, darknet, bitcoins, and so on. And that has put a challenge on the formal channels of transfers of money and so on to further these things. Is that, again, something that GICNT would like to look at as another source or vulnerability being added to the nuclear commerce? So 2 questions, UAE and the darknet side.
In GICNT, we do not address specific country situations. When we are planning and organizing our seminars, workshops, exercises, we are dealing with scenarios that are at the same time realistic, but are not specific to any particular country. And I think this is the way how we are able to keep ourselves detached from any political disagreements that might arise, and which would in effect prevent us from doing the work for which the GICNT is meant for. So this is the short answer to that. Regarding the question of the darknet and so forth, I will give a more general answer. We are all the time discussing in GICNT which relevant new developments should be introduced into our activities. And for this, we are relying also very much on the work that is being done by our free working groups, which combine the best specialists from the partner nations and from the international observer organizations, so that we would be able to see what are the crucial sticking points at the moment on which we should focus in our future activities. So without going into the specifics, we are following, of course, technological developments and really looking at the greatest risks that exist and try to take that into account when we are planning our program further.
Well, thank you all. Let's now move to look at some of the parts of the last slide that and the ambassador put up, which was cooperation programs here with Stimson. And we're going to try to do 2. One is the project we have with them on securing radioactive sources, and I'm going to speak for a few minutes. Very brief slide presentation. As a normal person here in Washington, D.C., I have a hard time not giving a PowerPoint. Though I must admit it's not as well named as all of the GICNT exercises. I actually think that's a challenge by GICNT, is to come up with great names that they have. Every other organization now faces that challenge. Seema Galat, my colleague here at Stimson, is going to look more at the trade side of that. I'm going to look more at the non-trade domestic side in the project. And then, of course, we'll turn to Cindy Vestergaard, who will speak about a new project. It's in development with Stuk. So, let me just quickly. This is reported trade and 2 categories of radioactive sources and also apparatus related to that. We don't really have a single easily identifiable source or registry of all the sources in the world. We don't really know where they are. So this was the thing that I could come up with next, and I think Seema is going to go into more detail about our finding. But as you can see there, the countries that are blank and white, they haven't reported any kind of trade at all, not just trade in radiological or radioactive sources, for example, any kind of trade at all to the UN in the last 3 or 4 years. So just think about those. There's only 2 countries that haven't reported trading in radioactive sources or apparatus like X-ray machines. And I will tell you from a previous study, we know that about 90% of those export those items. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the distribution of radioactive sources around the world. Given that widespread availability, one of the things that we wanted to look at is, well, what's the national legal framework for it? There is certainly an international standard. It's the Code of Conduct and Safety and Security of Radioactive Sources, but it's not obligatory. It's a voluntary commitment that you make, that you send to the IAEA that you're committed to the Code of Conduct. We wanted to look at key elements of that and then try to see what implementation of those elements was taking place at the national level. We suspect, and I would say this was furthered at a recent conference, the very first conference that the International Atomic Energy Agency held on securing radioactive sources, which was devoted to that, which was in December of this past year. We suspect that it's low, but we really didn't know. So that was one of the things we wanted to look at. And so we came up with this project that, working with the Government of Finland, to develop a compendium of all the laws and regulations that had specific requirements or obligations to secure radioactive sources or apparatus using radioactive materials or facilities. We'd look at any of those things, but just wanted to see laws and regulations, in no small part because we'd also had interest from Interpol and UN Office of Drugs and Crime. They were concerned that they didn't have enough information, at least publicly available information, on what the enforcement provisions would be. So were there penalties? That's what they wanted to know. That's part of the reason. So we limited it to just laws and regulations, and only those that had specific obligations to secure radioactive sources. So I'm going to do the first part, which is, as I said, more on the domestic implementation of the parts of the Code of Conduct, and then Seema is going to do more on, as you may know, that there's additional guidance on import and export of radioactive materials, and so Seema is going to look at that. So what did we find? We found, unfortunately, there's a lot of countries that don't have much, in contrast to that widespread availability. We also noticed that a lot of measures did not, create offenses. If they did create offenses, some cases they did have imprisonment or fines, kind of combinations. They had some sort of prohibitions. We'd look at that. But it was difficult to see penalties related to things like licensing in other words, you might suspend a license if there was a violation of you had not secured a radioactive source. But this was the main things that we looked at in terms of key security measures that we took from the Code of Conduct, what we could find in national measures. I'm going to do this pretty briefly. What you see here is sort of cumulatively, what did they do if you added those measures, did they have, there's 14 elements. If they had those, this is what you find. And unfortunately, what you see is that more than 80 countries we could not identify anything in terms of a legally binding obligation at domestic level to secure their radioactive materials. Physically protect, we had to look at that as well. So it's pretty disturbing. I would maybe put it in map form. You can see it a little bit better here. The lighter colored countries are the ones that had the higher score on our index, and the darker countries are the lower score. You may find, there may be conventional wisdom. Low capacity states don't have, they may be more of a challenge that they face in doing this, but there are quite a few high capacity states that don't seem to have much in the way of the security elements of the Code of Conduct. I would mention many of those may have quite a bit on the safety side, but not so much on the security side. And in fact, where states that do have security, significant security elements in their domestic legislation, many of them build on a existing safety framework. So it's being kind of built out from the safety side. But I will say it's not the picture that I would hope to see if we're concerned about securing radiological materials and their facilities, particularly against the threat of terrorist use of these items. Even in some states where there's, I would say, some European states, and I'm not going to say Sweden because that's not the one. There are other states that have look a little bit better in there, and they have a little bit lighter color on there. The penalties for, in some cases, the penalties, well, vary quite widely, as we'll go through this. The penalties for some European states, the penalty for criminal activity related to a violation of an obligation to secure radioactive sources imprisonment is measured in the days, not weeks, not months, not years, but days. And on the other hand, there's 4 states that have the death penalty related to this. So it's really all over the place. We've got, I think the average is in around 7 or 8 years. We're updating all of that kind of information. And I think that's one of the real takeaways is that we've got large and persistent gaps in the implementation of the existing code of conduct, much less anything you're thinking about strengthening these kinds of efforts through new guidance from the IAEA. It's already a challenge, and I think it's strengthening it is going to be even more of a challenge. One thing I do want to emphasize is we are committed to this notion that you need to measure it. If you don't start measuring things, I think it's very hard to make things change. And an example, by measuring it, one of the things that we did notice was that commitment to the code of conduct actually seems to matter. It's associated with higher levels of implementation of the code of conduct. So that's I can't say it's a causal relationship, but there is some sort of associative relationship there. And I think that may be helpful in understanding how do we strengthen the system. Do we work more on getting commitments to the code? Is that maybe a first step that we do before strengthening the code? I don't know, but I think it's something that we're going to do. And in the next steps, we're going to update. We're already started to update and expand this database. We're going to go back to the regulatory authorities of UN member states and say, this is what we've got. We're putting this online. One of the reasons Interpol and UN Office of Drugs and Crime were interested in this project to start with was when they were doing training or outreach on this issue, they could find very few examples in public of penalty provisions. And our data is linked to, so you could, if you go in the data set, it will say, here, where in the text you have the penalty provision, this is where it is, you can find it, you can look at this, and try to, and make these, as we do this, open and available to everybody. And hopefully we're going to do more analysis as we move ahead. As part of that, Seema's been working more, Dr. Glott's been working more on the trade side of this, and so let me turn this over to you. I think we're going to make a little technological switch here.
This is the one you're
using. Yeah, that's it. Let me go for it. So you're going to get it up on the, there you go.
Right. Thank you, Rick. My involvement in the project has been on the trade side because that's my specialization, strategic trade controls in management. So what I tried to do, and this work had already begun under Rick's leadership, and I've just made a little more contribution to it by adding to it data from all of the countries. We are looking at about 170 odd countries. With reference to the code of conduct and export and import of radiological materials. And, well, I'm taking a slightly different tack on this than Rick. Much of my data shows exact same trends that Rick has just shown you when you look at the global data. In fact, there are more in the last slide that he showed you between light pink and dark pink. There would probably be more light pinks in there. Because trade is not something that is explicitly mentioned in many of the regulations. But if you can see who's actually trading, you can see that there are, about, in 2017, 112 countries that are importing any kind of radiological materials. And exporting countries, they're about 91 now. And this comes only from one category of the UN Comtrade, which is HS 28440, radioactive elements, isotopes, and compounds. There are better, they're more well specified within this large category. There are other categories that we can then track later on. So I thought that instead of looking at global data, let's just look at some of the things which are the top among the developing countries, because I worked more with developing countries, helping them develop their or establish or strengthen their strategic trade control systems. So I looked at that. And according to the UN Comtrade, these are the top ranking developing countries who are engaged in exports and imports. You'll see a lot of overlap there. And I did top 14 just as a way of seeing who's doing what. And in total, there are about 19 countries. Some of them appear in both lists, exporting and importing countries. And you can see there are some surprising ones which I have to go back and check on. Brunei is not what I expected to be exporting a lot. So clearly it might be coming from somewhere else. Then you look at the data for these particular countries. I divided them into 3 different categories. In terms of legal infrastructure, you would see there is, one of these countries doesn't even have a law relating to trading in these materials. The radiological trade control body, only 6 of them have no body identified in their regulation. So it leads to, they refer to higher level body or empowered body or something like that, but there is no specific description even of who's taking care of this. And in 2 of these countries, and 2 of the 19, this issue area is being managed by non-technical agencies. So it could be something like an interministerial council or something. And the list of controlled sources in the regulation appears only in 10 countries. And you can move, as you move forward, within the regulatory infrastructure, you would see there are all kinds of, very few of these 19 countries actually have all of these things that I've looked at here. And on the enforcement side, the most interesting part was that enforcement bodies are, in a majority of these countries, they're all non-technical bodies like customs and police. They are the ones that are empowered to do something. But the regulation says nothing about training for these kinds of people. So how are they actually doing the enforcement? We really don't know. Awareness raising for stakeholders, even that is not mentioned. And when we come to awareness raising for the public on how to deal with these issues, it's just 0. So from just looking at these very small sample of countries, what you can see very clearly is that there is a mismatch. A lot of them are trading, but the regulatory capacity is much less than you would expect. Many countries regulate these sources as hazardous materials, which is both good and bad. The good part is, of course, that as hazardous materials, there is a safety aspect involved, just like Rick mentioned. And so they focus on safety in use during domestic transport. And this is where I think a little bit of outreach on UN regulations on transport of hazardous goods may be something that could take care of this. This I see as a low-hanging fruit, really, if we want to improve things. Then where they mention laws, exports and imports are regulated, but no licensing mechanisms are actually outlined there. This I also see as a positive thing, because in this case, if the law mentions these transactions, you don't actually have to change the law to make the changes in implementing. You can change procedures. So implementing rules and regulations that do not require parliamentary approvals, for instance, would be a best way of making a change over there. And then for the awareness agencies being non-technical, yes, it's a very crucial gap, and we do need to have at least awareness, if not training for them. That might be something for stakeholders, global stakeholders in this issue area to look at. And the users are majority civilian. We are talking about hospitals and companies that are making devices and so on. So again, this is an issue area where we can have much more awareness, at facilities during transport for trade and so on. And it can be done more systematically. It can be done through, for instance, trade fairs and so on. So again, I see all of these things that are things that can be done fairly easily. But then, of course, if we need to make very deep impact, it would take a little more resource in terms of doing gap analysis for some of the major countries, and then going deep into what are the different things that we can change over there. So this is just the first cut at looking at the data for these rugby countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Please, Cindy.
Thank you. Oh, I'm good. No slides.
Oh,
No.
that's
Before I get into blockchain, just quickly talk about a project that the Safeguards. I'm the director of the Nuclear Safeguards Program. I should introduce myself first. At the Stimson Center, a project that we have funded by the MacArthur Foundation called Back End to the Future. And with that project, we look at the safety, or not so much the safety, the security and safeguards of geological disposal of spent nuclear fuel. So in this way, of course, we have connected with the Finns, and particularly in looking at what you've been doing with the Deep Geological Repository, the first in the world to be constructed. It's an amazing feat. We actually visited back in October, and we brought some friends with us even. And I highly recommend taking a look at what we call field notes on Stimson's website. You'll see some great pictures and also some of our thoughts as we were going through the repository. And for me, this really points to, and I'll lead this into the blockchain, is how Finland has been leading the way on something that is incredibly politically and publicly sensitive. Disposal of nuclear waste across the globe is basically kick the can down the road. You get there might be a good big review. You have the Blue Commission, for example, in the United States. Then another government comes in, administration, and then wants another review. And then another review and another review, and nothing ever gets done. In the meantime, the interim storage of spent fuel is increasing. So, of course, this has implications for more targets for nuclear terrorism, also in terms of accidents. Of course, the interim storage has been incredibly safe or throughout the decades, but it is something where a lot of interim storage facilities globally are reaching their capacity. So I think in this case, with what we're looking at with Finland in terms of the Back End to the Future project and our engagement with them is really to learn and understand how their approach has been able to get them where they are today. And then what that could mean potentially for other countries. And so best practices has been very interesting to see how that's been moving forward. Along with this emerging facility, Finland has also, we have started to have a conversation last year about blockchain, or more specifically distributed ledger technology, DLT, of which blockchain is a subset. I'm not going to get into all the details. I can of course answer some questions. And here you can see where an emerging facility, such as a deep geological repository, has to think decades, hundreds of years ahead. And of course, that's almost an impossible feat when we're coming to think about technology and also the political risks that might come down the road. But it requires a different type of vision in your thinking. And with this way, what types of technology need to be in place when it comes to long-term information management? How do you make sure your records today, you keep those archives going, so for future generations? Blockchain, or DLT, can also help in terms of the information management of safeguards. So that information that goes from operators to the regulator, from the regulator, in this case, to Euratom, and then Euratom to the International Atomic Energy Agency. This system, of course, also for national safeguard systems vary across countries, but there is certainly an overarching system in terms of the International Atomic Energy Agency itself. Looking at this is that what is the potential for blockchain to be able to apply to those challenges that currently exist within safeguard systems? So, for example, much more secure streamlining and immutable ledger. Finland already has an immutable type of ledger system, but there are challenges, of course, when it comes to its reporting to Euratom and then what that means also from Euratom to the IAEA. So last year, Stimson Center had a project with the Stanley Foundation where we were looking at nuclear safeguards and blockchain, or DLT specifically, and come up with a number of areas where we think that this could actually help streamline and secure the information management of safeguards. This then led to us now getting to the point with Stuk, and we're really excited about this to start hopefully in the summer, looking at the potential of doing a small demo first and then leading to a full proof of concept for a national state system of accounting and control. And just lastly on this, I think this is where you can see Finland is a pioneer, not just in terms of emerging facilities and emerging or maybe emerged tech, but also in terms of the way that, from my perspective, engaging with them and how they go through and socialize the technology and the facility as they're going through it. And I think this is one of the things that this quiet, I know you're modest, but this quiet and methodical approach to looking at these facilities, because a deep geological repository has been 40 years in the making. It takes a lot of patience. And then same thing on the technology side, that what does this mean for acceptability of your operators, but also in terms of your other stakeholders in the process. So I'm really looking forward to the next years in looking at this and the potential and how it would work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cindy. And on that note, let me open it up to the audience and to my others on the panel. I don't know if Ambassador Luoto, if you'd like to make any comments now that you've heard more about what we are doing.
No, just over my appreciation for the work that's been done with this project, and we are very much looking forward to the new developments with the Stimson. We are really excited, and really think that it's important that at the same time as we are trying to make sure that our systems regarding the high radioactive nuclear waste are the best possible that we can have, that at the same time we are able to develop something that will be useful for the wider international community, and in that way we can enhance nuclear security and safeguards. So we are very much looking forward to this continued cooperation and results from this exciting new technology, how to implement that with the nuclear safeguards.
So please, feel free.
Chile, where you're looking at, maybe this is coming down the road, is looking at producers such as Chile, which produce radioisotopes, in this case, if I can never say it, the TC99, technetium. Anyway, TC99, where they produce that only for domestic purposes. There's no exports. Do you notice any shift with countries that only do that in terms of their approach to domestic regulations?
Well, in terms of approach to domestic regulations, if you don't, I can say a couple of things. One is, it's, there are many countries that actually import and export a lot of things beyond what they produce, and I say that also because they consume many of these things, obviously, and in some instances they're re-exports, but the uses are so widespread. For example, I haven't talked about this, but I could speculate as to why Brunei has such a high score on there. It's because it's widely used in oil and gas exploration for well logging machines, or that's.
But they're put as exporters. That's what was
well, and this is and the problem is in many instances, many states, for example, would get a source, and then it go back out, which we might think of as a re-export, as not being, but they'll count it as an export, basically. That's just how many states report it. They don't report much about re-exports, and that may be part of what's going on here. But I don't really see that if you produce the source that it's really limited. I'd have to go back and look at Chile in a particular way, but many of the Latin American states and several others are building it on their safety standards, and to the extent that they would have safety standards in place, which I think Chile does, they would have safety standards in place. They would use that existing mechanism if they have security obligations. So they would use it to, for example, the inspection system. They'd use essentially the same set of inspectors. Where I think there's a big difference is the safety standard. You're not, usually most of that is not, you don't really talk about law enforcement. And I will say that was a big point of discussion in December at the International Atomic Energy Agency meeting, was about how do you engage law enforcement. And Interpol, a colleague there, John Buchanan, essentially said, we catch crooks, criminalize it. And, I'm paraphrasing there, but that's, So that'd be one thing that you would see that would start to be a distinction from the old safety view, which is much more built on, okay, this is a safety infraction. We need to do more training. We need to do more interaction to bring the people into compliance. Whereas to some extent on the security level, you certainly want that. But you also have to be aware that there are nefarious actors out there, and then you bring in the criminal side of it. So.
And actually, just to add to that, I don't have the data in front of me, but Chile does appear among both exporting and importing countries for some of the radiological sources. So.
Please.
I know that Richard didn't really want to talk about specific countries, but just looking at the map, 3 of them sort of leap out at the casual observer, and I wonder if you could explain why they're on the list at the low end. Obviously Sweden, Finland's next door neighbor, but also Japan and Israel seem to be on the low end of laws and regulations in this area, so how can that be?
Okay. So the question was, which some of these states look like they'd be out of sorts. First off, the data can be wrong. This is a complex enterprise. We're looking across 193 states. We are going back to all the regulatory authorities, and we could just have missed things. Language interpretation is an example. I will say that of the measures we have, 80% of them come from countries where English is not the first language. So we actually haven't been able to get at that challenge. But in Sweden's case, at least from what I understand, they have a great safety system, but they haven't yet added the security and physical protection elements to it. And that is likely to be the case. I think with Iceland was another example out there. And to an extent, I'm not so sure about Israel, but I think it does as well. I'm sorry, the third country was Japan. And I think it's the same there, is that, they have, and in fact, there's been, after Fukushima, some interesting discussions about what happens even if you have a great safety culture. You sometimes think, well, we can't happen here because we've got a great safety culture. Well, there are other things going on there. And so that's one of the concerns. And I think Japan has just amended some of its security laws in this area. And so that wouldn't have captured this. We started basically using 2015 law data. And we've tried to update it since then, but that was kind of we haven't had one over the last few months. Japan just recently amended some legislation in a variety of areas related to security gaps that they saw in addressing the 2020 Olympics. So they're aware that this is, an issue that they face, and how do you address it?
I had one additional thing. One of the things that I noticed on that part of the data that Rick is talking about, in many cases, countries that have large nuclear establishments tend to have many more regulations on nuclear materials as opposed to the radioactive ones, because they're considered low-level, low-threat kind of things. And so that may also explain what is being captured in the data. And sometimes these kinds of regulations appear as ordinances and so on, not necessarily the law. So if we haven't got to that level, it's not being captured here.
Sir?
Hi, my name is Joe Kendall. I work at the State Department on GICNT issues. So thank you to all of you for the tremendously informative presentation. Some great work on the legal infrastructure that I think is vastly needed. So my question is for Ambassador Luoto. So for GICNT, it's an initiative that very much avoids the sort of naming and shaming aspects of nuclear security. So when you see a map sort of like that, how do you consider it from your position as the GICNT IIG coordinator in utilizing it in future work?
It's a good question, and I'm sure that we will actually be working on that. GICT has been doing a lot of work on legal frameworks in looking at how states are implementing the international agreements and whatever guidance we have available. And I'm convinced that this type of research and database gives us a good background to start thinking about how we can take this into account when we are planning our future activities. And without addressing specific countries, we can take a look, and this is what we have been doing in the past, by making sure that we do some events which gather and attract countries in a specific region where you can see risks that might not appear somewhere else. So I think that with this philosophy, by looking at where these kind of gaps exist, and by including that in our planning, where to do activities, specifically considering the legal frameworks, I think that we can make use of the data and do some good work in helping those countries in addressing the issues. So I'm quite sure that we will be discussing them and looking more in detail into the ways how we can make benefit of the work that is being done.
And I prefer to call it naming without shaming.
Yeah,
that's just because it isn't seen as, and this is from my 1540 UN Security Council resolution background. Is, I do believe you need to measure, but the idea is this should be a cooperative exercise to help improve the implementation of commitments that have been made in code of conduct, and maybe help improve that. So, it is a difficult balance, though. We don't want to,
100% agree, but I would like to go to the political side of what
Right.
does. It's a balancing act.
And I saw another handout earlier. I do want to encourage. I would note we have gender parity on this, and we are committed to diversity in this in Stimson Center. It's an important core value of the Stimson Center. I've not seen any hands from any of our...
And just to chime in on that, normally we say that men can do the work too.
Yes. I am the only senior person in our entire non-proliferation group that is male. So please, let me encourage you to if you have questions, please do. While you're thinking about that, we do have one hand earlier. So please, if you're... I thought there was one other... Yeah.
Yeah, back to the other question. Do we see countries that are not taking this seriously enough? And what measures can we employ, more than diplomatic, to encourage them to be a little bit more resourceful in this respect?
Seema, if you don't, well, you can chime in too on,
yes,
please. But on the domestic side, I would say certainly that's the case. The number of times you'll go to a country and speak to people not in the nuclear field, let's say some parliamentarians, and you will say, we don't have any of this, and you'll have to say, yes, you do. Let's just go down the street and look at the clinic that uses radioactive sources for health purposes, or let's go oil and gas. So that's a challenge in many cases. That people in senior positions, in both on the policy side, I would say in the legislature, often just don't know that these things exist within their own country, and so I think that does require a fair amount of outreach. Personally, I also would be encouraged if we move towards, in the security side, making the code of conduct or something similar, some existing international standard that's currently voluntary, to think more about how do we make it obligatory, because then I think that raises awareness as well. But it's outreach is still a big challenge. It's surprising the number of places you'll go. You'll see a city with where people are building all these huge buildings and there'll be no understanding that there's, radiography going on, that people are using cameras to inspect the buildings. And they're right outside the door. And people will say, no, we don't have anything. And yet they do. So that's a big challenge. And I know also on the import-export side is...
No, in both the cases, for export-import as well as security-related regulations, one of the issues that you face once the countries are even made aware, the challenge is they usually don't have an idea of where to begin, because the requirements are so many. If you just look at the elements that we have counted, there's like 40 plus, and if you actually want to implement them in an honest and efficient way, it's way more than that. So I see the biggest challenge from the outside as trying to sort of whittle down to what do we really want them to focus attention on and do just those things. And that has to do much more with matching it to the actual vulnerabilities that they face. You have to make that connection that this is actually a vulnerability for your region, even if it's not for your country. The most common statement I have heard, for instance, when we've done these anonymous quizzes and so on, where people can click without showing where they are from, and in international groups, is to say that radiological security is a problem, terrorism is an issue that we have to deal with. But then when I ask the question, so would your government be doing something, they say no. And the answer usually comes from, well, we have terrorists and we have radiological materials, but our terrorists don't seem to be interested in radiological materials. So you have to make a different kind of connect in order for them to do something and expend political and economic resources on this.
Well, we think that the major event is going to have to occur for people to take it more seriously.
We hope not.
We hope not, but our experience across the non-proliferation realm is typically something is reactive. And to the efforts, I think, of countries in GICNT and elsewhere is trying to be proactive. But often for a lot of states, it's a reactive enterprise, which is why GICNT also does things on, if I recall correctly, on forensics and investigations and things like that, unfortunately.
A couple of suggestions. Ambassador, I've done some trainings for the Japan Atomic Energy Agency, and I've spent some time in the Sendai Prefecture in the Fukushima before the incident happened. At that time, the GE built system, there was a risk that waves might cross over from the barrier. The Japanese Defense Agency then said, if we raise it, you might be a target of the North Korean missiles and so on. And we are in the last 10 years of the plant and so on. And so they didn't have any automatic electrical backup once the manual system failed. And that's what had happened there. Later, when we engaged with them, this question came that Seema was talking about, that safety was strong, security protocols were weak. Japan being a very top-down system, the MFA and the leadership had not understood. So I'm making two quick suggestions. One is, part of the recommendations that come out of Stimson reports can have technical suggestions on dealing with certain types of challenges. And Japan does annually an Asian Export Control Seminar that many of us speak at. It's attended by about 40 plus countries. It would be a very good place, I think, for some of this report and presentation to be made by GICNT or somebody. The other is, there is a 21 country body that Seema and I are part of, a technical working group on CSCAP, Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. Once again, has the same family of countries that have RAD sources, activities, better understanding on safety, but very little on the security, and certainly not the implementing side of it. So that would be another place, I think, for doing something like this. The final point I'd make is, you can also perhaps look at the Guam countries, the Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Moldova type, where the initial flow of Soviet or Russian RAD materials and others have happened, and where they went. There's sizable literature on that, including sources where it has gone and so on. that type of tracking in a chapter within these types of reports to talk about the scale of the problem and the analysis of the pathology of the problem. What happened? Why did we fail for 15, 20 years in dealing with that? I think that then provides both the substance of the risk we are dealing with, as well as the methodologies and learnings from the last 20 years. That then with the technical suggestions would make for a more compelling type of an argument. And then we present to these types of bodies. So that would be my suggestion to GICNT.
Just to say that these are very good, worthwhile proposals, and I want to underline the fact that during this project, Rick has been talking to IEA, to Interpol, and this is what the GICNT is doing all the time. These are our international observer organizations, and we are very much partnering with them every time we are planning our events. So I'm quite convinced and that we will be feeding the results of what we have learned in this project into the discussions that we are having with these international organizations, so that they can also take in these results and conclusions into account when they are planning their future activities. At the December conference that Rick has been referring to, we heard that Interpol is now trying to invest more resources into training of its member states' authorities, so that they would be more aware of these risks. They see this as a great challenge, and I think this type of material that we have been able to produce together with the Stimson will be useful for them when they are planning their future activities, and the same goes for the other partner organizations that are also working for nuclear security.
And just one related to that, I would mention the International Atomic Energy Agency report. In that same meeting, there was some discussions about the nuclear security support centers, NSSCs, that many states have these to help train their own cadre of officials and those working in various facilities about nuclear security. So in their survey, they looked at two elements were stood out to me. They asked, well, what kind of training courses are you giving? And what kind of training courses do people want? At the top of the list was more training on securing radioactive sources. At the bottom of the list of what they were training was training courses on security of radioactive sources. So there's a lot of potential for additional training and being able to bring that in as a specific thing that could be done for to help countries out in overcoming these gaps. Well, we have a few more minutes, so please, we'll take some more questions. Any more hands? Panelists, any Ambassador, do you have any closing?
Only to thank all the participants and the Stimson Center for organizing this and taking an interest in this important topic. And this is really work in progress, as you have heard. So we will be coming back to these issues in future occasions. Thank you.
And on behalf of the Stimson Center, thank you all. And please give a round of applause to Ambassador Luoto. Thank you. You all. And I think we have to leave.
Yes, we have to leave
right away because there's another meeting.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's great. Very well structured. Yeah.
Yes. I owe you an email.
Yeah.